Hey folks, if you're a fan of horror and want to hear about something truly disconcerting, I'm going to be talking about Miro Havarinen's nightmarish RPG, Fear and Hunger. A title so brutally obtuse that even talking about some of its core mechanics will draw away from its oppressive atmosphere by providing even a partial understanding of the world's underpinnings. That said, if you're still here, that means you're just as eager as me to ask the question, was Fear and Hunger an experience starved of any joy, or was there fun to be found in its dismal depths? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Within the kingdom of Rondon rests an ancient fortress, a decrepit ruin which saw some use as a prison for those better left forgotten. That is, until the darkness that festered in its depths began to stir, warping those who lurked within. Even now, the dungeon still beckons fresh souls to brave its blood-soaked corridors, whether they be lured by whispers of ancient knowledge, the promise of gold, an enduring loyalty, or a burning vendetta. All their goals intersect with the fate of one man. But will they be satisfied with simply pursuing their own desires, or will they become consumed by what lies at the heart of the dungeons of Fear and Hunger? Now, as far as the synopsis goes, this is a fairly surface level description, largely because I want to avoid any major spoilers, especially those associated with the story beats that rest central to the game. In fact, I'd argue that the act of soaking in the peculiarities while blind and slowly unearthing the deeper narrative layers is a major facet of the experience, and lends itself quite well to the overarching feeling of oppressiveness, horror, and mystery that continually drove me to delve further. That said, I can at least talk a bit about the diverse storytelling methods which are at play, because it does use a fair number of tools towards this end. Amongst these, the most blatant is the character introductions. See, when you pick a character, you're provided with a brief interactive story, which serves as a vehicle to choose certain starting skills, but also provides some fairly distinct details about the character, their motivations for coming to the dungeon, details about their personality, and even some elements about the world at large. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. As you begin to make your way into the dungeon and search around, it won't be long until you start to encounter lore books. What's interesting about these is that the acquisition is wholly random. While normally this would drive me absolutely crazy, this is one of those rare instances where it works rather well, because the results of your search for reading material aren't seeded or otherwise locked in. This, by extension, means that should you die, and you will, horribly, the next time you delve into an area while retracing your steps, there'll be a new array of tomes to pick up and read through, allowing you to gradually progress your understanding of the world, even despite the other setbacks you faced. And this is made even more rewarding by the fact that these aren't all isolated chunks of backstory. Some of the tomes you'll read help to clarify important details pertinent to your overall success, such as detailing the various status ailments you'll acquire over the course of the game, and thus increasing your odds of survival. And speaking of story elements that can influence those odds, you actually have the ability to speak with the entities you encounter during combat. While this doesn't always go well for you, there are some surprisingly interesting details you can learn if you're willing to take that risk, and even some encounters that you can influence or outright bypass with a few choice words. Though this doesn't just apply in combat. Scattered throughout the dungeons are a few sparse characters you can stumble across, each with their own stories. While you could simply murder them for equipment or to satisfy some perverse sense of morbid curiosity, talking with them further allows you to potentially advance their goals, learning more about them and the dungeon in the process. It also gives you the means of failing miserably and leading them to their death. This detail also extends to the other playable characters as well, since you can meet all of them within the dungeon. Figuring out where they are and what they want is needed in order to recruit them to your party, and also provide some interesting details about their personality that you'd otherwise miss out on if you were playing them. Admittedly, snagging all of them can be tricky, since at least one of them has a timed element associated with them. And all of this so far that I've been talking about is just the journey. In the case of outcomes, there's actually a solid handful of different destinations that you can arrive at. endings which are fairly varied insofar as the routes to achieve them and the unique challenges associated with each one. Though none are quite so brutal as the character-specific endings, known as the S ranks. These require that players tackle the game on its hardest difficulty while engaging with certain key tasks associated with the given character. Tasks which I had no desire to engage with because the hardest difficulty disables saves. And just no. In fact, now seems like a great time to actually talk shop about playing Fear and Hunger as a game and underline just why this is such an incredibly daunting idea to me. Simply put, Fear and Hunger is a brutally difficult game that revels in every horrible death that's going to happen to you. It's not even an exaggeration to say that the first few rooms do an absolutely great job of teaching you exactly what you should expect. See, after going through the opening and getting some meager supplies and skills, I emerged into a forlorn-looking courtyard. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of dogs barking, perhaps lured by the dead horse on the ground, or the much-needed supplies resting in rotting barrels and boxes. Heedless, I loot even as the barking grows closer, right before a pair of dogs burst into view. I felt brave, they were just dogs, and within moments my health was shredded, the hero bleeding, and still worse besides. All of which culminated in a coin flip that saw me instantly die, my face being torn apart.
Remind yourself that overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer.
Back into the breach I went, but this time I sift for the supplies faster, briefly intrigued by how the supplies are different, but fearful of dawdling too long. I don't even pause to beat the dead horse this time. Instead, I dive into the dungeon just as the dogs appear, only to run face first into a grotesquely tumescent guard who shears off one of my arms turn one before promptly blowing my health away. Okay then, third try. The dogs are juked, the guard's woven past, an even better assortment of items are snagged, things are looking good, and then I step on a rusty nail sticking out of a floorboard, become afflicted by a mysterious ailment, and then promptly die from an infection several rooms later. This is the Fear and Hunger experience, and despite the sheer vertical nature of its difficulty scaling or the illusion of unfairness it may cultivate in the uninitiated, there's a dread logic behind its machinations. Instead of being a traditional RPG where players simply murder everything and scale up, Fear and Hunger is closer to a dark fantasy survival game. Rather than lure players into countless combat encounters with the promise of experience, players are immediately introduced to the dangers of combat, where every injury taken might have far-reaching consequences for your long-term survival, whether it be the loss of a limb to an enemy or a crushing blow permanently reducing your max health. Even minor damage represents a grave threat, if only due to the finite amount of healing supplies in the game. In and of themselves, this makes combat a truly harrowing prospect, and the process of learning and discovering an enemy's attack patterns of paramount importance, especially since this isn't as simple as just mashing the attack command. See, much in the same manner as their ability to dismember you, you can do the same to them, surgically severing parts off of them in order to reduce their threat to a manageable level, or finding ways to knock them off balance you can land a decisive blow on a weak point. All in order to end a fight quickly. This also means clever usage of items and status ailments can help to shift an otherwise unwinnable encounter in your favor. Also, while I did emphasize the sheer lethality of the coin flips, I should mention they aren't entirely luck-based. See, if you defend, it completely nullifies the risk, and the game is kind enough to typically signal when one is coming in a fight, as long as you're paying attention. All in all, these factors come together to make each encounter a deadly puzzle, whether it be a common enemy or the more lethal unique enemies. Admittedly, this probably sounds like a massive warning against fighting anything if you can help it. That said, there are some benefits that can warrant the risk if you can get good Perhaps the most obvious perk is that you can search the corpses of dead enemies for supplies, and their uses hardly end there either. If you have a rare drop known as a soul stone, corpses can charge them, allowing you to use them as currency to learn more skills in a character, or alternatively to curse a weapon, boosting its stats and being able to hurt ghosts. Except in the case of unique enemies, who provide boss soul stones instead, which function as extremely powerful accessories. There's also the ability to eat a dead enemy that a certain character can do, but I'll actually caution about doing this before you search the enemy's corpse, because if you eat an enemy, it will just eat all of the items on their body as well, which can screw you over pretty badly. Still, all of this together does provide a solid motive to engage in a bit of targeted murder. That said, for the truly daring, there is a legitimately compelling reason to try and clear out a floor. And that's saving. So you can't freely save your game in Fear and Hunger. Sure, there are rare books you can find that let you save anywhere, but the most accessible means of doing so requires that you track down one of the beds scattered throughout the world. Now, finding these locations isn't too bad. What is a problem is that almost all of these initiate a coin flip when used, and if you fail said flip, you're ambushed by one of the monsters on the floor. Which is where mass murder comes into play, since if everything on the floor is deader than a doornail, nothing can ambush you, allowing you to save fairly freely. Well, at least so long as there's beds, since there are a few lengthy segments where you'll be hard-pressed to take a nap. I do have to give the game credit though, since there are quite a few shortcuts scattered about which help to make the dungeon feel fairly porous once you familiarize yourself with its layout. Or I guess, layouts, given that while there are quite a few static areas, there's also a number which change things up from instance to instance, helping to keep each run fresh, while also lending itself to a sense of uncertainty and trepidation that lurks at the core of the game, and it helps to exacerbate the overall survival elements of Fear and Hunger. Speaking of which, while combat represents the fastest way to die, that hardly covers the gamut. As you dive deeper into the dungeons, you'll need to manage your hunger, your mind, and your overall status. Hunger's simple enough. Scavenge and eat food in order to avoid increasingly crippling debuffs and, well, a slow and horrific death. Mind, however, is a bit more of a problem given that the very nature of the dungeon and its darkness gradually eats away at your character's sanity. While this drain can be slowed with torches, which also provide a helpful view of the dungeon, it can also be massively exacerbated through the careless use of skills or spells, since all of these drain mind. There are items that can help to replenish this, but these tend to be rarer than food. And this is where the problem begins. See, all characters start with phobias, which makes them more vulnerable to specific types of enemies, and also cause them to lose more sanity. That said, if a character's sanity drops to 0, they'll develop panophobia, which makes them vulnerable to everything. What's more, if you let any character other than your main stay too low, they'll have a mental breakdown and potentially quit the party unless you restore them. Which is then further complicated by the simple fact that while getting more characters certainly helps deal with the combat encounters, it will strain your resources very quickly, which makes balancing how many people you want to recruit and when a very important consideration. Especially given that maintaining them in the event of running into a trap or any other form of AoE damage means you're also expending healing resources faster than you would otherwise, and God help you if a party member winds up with a status ailment, since unless you found the book that tells you what they do, you might wind up burning through a lot of resources just trying to figure out how to save a character, which is pretty harrowing when it's been a while since you last saved, and you have something nasty like an infection, which kills you if it progresses and requires you, if you do not have the specific item, to hack off the infected limb with a bone saw if you're not prepared. Even Darkest Dungeon felt more forgiving compared to this. Vastly more forgiving than this. And this extends to the visuals as well. There's just something deeply uncomfortable about a lot of the imagery in Fear and Hunger, and it barely takes any time at all to encounter it. It isn't just the fact that the characters enemies alike will show signs of lingering injuries as the fight progresses. No, what truly makes things disconcerting is the designs themselves. There's a grotesque perversity to a number of the abominations you'll face off against. It's not even I'm not even exaggerating when I say that the lumbering mound of meat that passes for a guard and its quivering phallic stinger is just the tip of the iceberg. There's just some uncomfortable things waiting for you as you delve further down that makes the intimidating sense of awe that some enemies elicit feel comparatively welcoming. Seriously, there's just some intensely bad things that can happen to you as a result of losing a coin flip. Little animations that are just... they're a part of the reason this video has a trigger warning, and some of them just aren't included because I don't want to be demonetized. The overworld isn't exempt from this either. While there are some areas which aren't too bad to wander through even in the dark, others maintain this overall air of unpleasantness. Honestly, this segment here and the dungeon within are a really stellar example of some great stage design. Incidentally, if you're hoping for some form of respite, even the sound design is out to get you. Lord knows I was jump scared so many times by the chord that plays whenever an enemy spots you. The music though, it's just downright creepy and stress-inducing, whether it's the more active tracks or the ambient ones that accompany your journey. Which is a whole lot of words. So let me sum things up simply. Fear and Hunger deserves every bit of hype you may have heard about it. Horror is a genre that frequently bounces off of me, not because I don't necessarily like the games, but more due to a reliance on jump scares or a simple lack of tension. That said, this one stuck with me. Whether it's the deeply uncomfortable narrative beats, the perpetual tension afforded by the game's survival elements, and the uncertainty that's invoked by the explorations, the awful choices you're forced to make, and the abominations that serve as adversaries. All of these factors build on top of each other and intertwine in such a way that the entire experience can only be described as intensely oppressive and a perpetually harrowing descent where the stakes only ever get higher. And it's this sheer adversity which makes the process of intuiting the underlying mechanics and gradually mastering them satisfying. While there's always going to be nasty surprises in store for you, things gradually get to a point where you'll be able to explore a bit more freely. You'll be able to seek out secrets which were out of reach before, pursue narrative threads you'd missed out during earlier run-throughs, or to apply items that you'd originally undervalued in new and different ways in order to change up how a fight goes and to turn it into a far more manageable melee. But anyways, this is starting to beat a dead horse here, so I'll say it plainly. I think Fear and Hunger is a crit hit. I highly recommend this game, and during the time I was playing with it, I was keenly focused on it. I can't even count the amount of times I'd have a run abruptly cut off by ignoble death, by resources growing dry, or worse, making heaps of progress only to get crippled after I'd failed to save in a while. I'd rage. I'd feel like I was done with the game, and then an hour or two later, I was delving right back into it, unable to deny its sickly siren call. If you can stomach the game's contents, and if you're willing to confront the difficulty wall it faces you up against from the get-go, you'll find a complex title to obsess over. And hey, if all the doom and gloom is getting to you, there's a weird fourth wall breaking dungeon crawling dating sim just squirreled away as a secret mode. Dungeon Nights, the perfect reward for beating this kind of game. Yeah. Anyways, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to help support the channel, and to my merch house for neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and mouse pads, and also a Humble Bundle link. That all said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.